I think there was a joke that goes something like, if you want to make God laugh, tell him about your plans for the future. So, and I think we had that also with Mary's talk on the pagans trying to micromanage the gods for their future and what the happiness should be looking like. And so maybe it's funny that we should talk about, the imaging of the future here. But on the other hand, it's the feast day of St. Thomas Aquinas. God also gave us a mind to participate in his providence. So we're not just mere playthings of his providence, we participate in that. And so there is secondary agency, if you want. And so it is all right for us to think about possible futures, and it is even necessary to do so because we do have to make decisions about that. Now, I can also introduce my panel all at once, but the reason, of course, is rather sad because Kevin Starr was meant to be on that panel. It's interesting that he would have been the historian on the panel. That is someone who tells the narrative of the past, and perhaps that would tell us something about the telos or the trajectory where that narrative is going. Michael Oborne, whom I'm introducing now, on the other hand, has really the future in mind and has had it as a matter of policy. He had got his education here at UC Berkeley with a BA, MA, and PhD, but also from Cambridge and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and has then taught international in many places, including in Paris and Berkeley, and was then since 1980 until 2011 working for the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in Paris. As a senior research fellow, executive assistant to the Deputy Secretary General, head of the Science and Technology Policy Division. I'm not going through all of that, there's a lot of it. But in all of that, displaying an area of expertise in biotechnology, innovation policy frameworks, and information technology policy. So that will certainly help us to image the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father. I'll just add 2 words to that so you get context. For the last 10 years, I was involved in what's called strategic foresight, and that's what I'm going to talk to you a bit about now. I was in communication with Kevin Starr over the last month. We were planning how we would divide the discussion, particularly on methodologies. Historical methodologies, truth functions in history, and also how we look at what might be coming on the basis of historical accounts. And that's where he was going to leave it with me to start. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what this is, because there are this will give you a context for what I'm going to say in terms of the content. Some of this has been covered by very interesting and competent lecturers and commentators and questions before. So I'm going to skip over some of the things that I was going to talk about and then come back maybe in the discussion period to deal with those. Those are particularly about groundbreaking innovations and is there a predictable path-dependent possibility of looking into the future for technological development. So one of the first things that I did in the science department, the science policy department, was we were working with national academies of science and ministries of science to look at expenditures. It was very simple. Where should we put, if we have limited resources, where should we put our money? And these are mostly governments that are dealing with squabbling scientific fields that all want resources. But they're not all equal in the resource parliament. There are large-scale developments or of infrastructure that is needed in physics, for instance, and very low-level funding compared to that in microbiology. So the government turned to us and said, can you establish a method by which we have a two-step process? The first step is, tell us where we are on the frontier of your knowledge. Where are we today? Second step is, tell us where you want to be in 10 years. Third step was for us, how much does the delta factor cost? So they said, in physics, they said to us, we need at least another collider, and that's going to be 1/2 of the budgets of all the governments in the world if we're going to build it. So everybody else said, we don't need another collider. What we actually need is to know more about this and that and the other thing. But the world of science is, in policy and instruction in the academy, is much like any academic institution, and even others, like the church. There are established interests that are very old. And in the science community, it's the physicist community that largely rules the roost in terms of providing guidance and also providing quite a lot of the innovative ideas that are going forward. In Europe, engineering academies play a very important role. In the United States, a little less, but now beginning to play a significant role in the innovation side, because institutions like MIT, Caltech, and Carnegie Mellon have began to use the Academy of Engineering. So there was this effort to envision, where is a discipline moving? What will it look like? And so we called this process run the video ahead. In your life, you run the video ahead 10 years. Where are you? And everybody who you ask this question to confidently begins, and then within 5 minutes realizes they're way out of their depth, because there are too many factors and moving parts in the analysis to, even on a personal basis, even to say, what will I be doing? Will I be married? Will I have children? Will I have a job? What part of the country will I be living in, etc.? So obviously, this consultation methodology of experts, which is called Delphi method, is one way to say, where will we be in the years to come in our field? And it's generally done field related. It is not done general society related. That's a meta exercise that's done later. So, and in this regard, we approached the Vatican to begin to talk to them about doing something for the Catholic Church of 2050. Where and what does it look like? So the second point I'd like to make is timeframes. We've been talking today about contemporary, short-term, and to some extent medium-term timeframes. So in our business, medium-term is 3 years. Short-term is about 6 months. These are, classical economics uses these categories. Long-term, that's the last one that we're looking at, is usually 30 to 50 years. Well, no data set of any type will give you any reliable prediction for anywhere near that far out. And that brings us to what is the reliability of this kind of imaging. So let me run you through a bit of what this looking down 25, 30 years, what it is, and then we'll look at some substantive examples of this. And I'm counting on Manuel to keep me within the agreed time. He'll tell me when. This is a technique. It's not a discipline in itself. It's using other disciplines. It's forecast. It's called forecasting. Foresight, not forecasting. Forecasting is what economists do. It's what weather people do. Forecasting has the implication of it being more well-grounded in fact, and even a reliable prediction. It was developed when the term to forecast was actually developed in World War I in the military. when they were looking at problems of manpower and supply in the armies in continental Europe. So how do you do foresight? You do the obvious things, which is gather data. You now stagger and compare, analyze, and create large-scale data reserves and archives. And big data, we've been talking a lot about this. This is a new adventure, new opportunity to use the vast amounts of information that have become available. The problem is nobody can make sense of them because they are dynamic pieces that are developed, that are continuously developing. So any prediction made on the basis of simply of a photo moment of big data is not going to be reliable. So you have the problem of how do you handle quantitative information and qualitative information? Because we've been talking all along about both. And the usual technique is to use quantitative information to establish your prejudiced point of view and then use qualitative information to bring everybody to it. So it carefully mixes the two sources of information. You can create models. This is something that's traditionally done in many of the sciences and in economics. You can do something called horizon scanning, which I think all of you have done in one way or another. If you have children, you're horizon scanning constantly to know what's going to happen, where they're going to be, where they're going to go to college, what are the opportunities for investment to ensure that kind of education, for instance. It's a multidisciplinary approach. It does not use just the hard sciences. As I said, it's not foretelling, predicting, or forecasting. In its best way, it is not a colonization of the future. This was a term that I first heard in 1980 by a very famous mathematician from MIT who came to a conference, and he was very skeptical of this. He said, this is a means of preparing people for a path-dependent thinking. And I don't like this. And he called it colonizing the future. So we've been very aware that this is part of it, part of the exercise. It's geographically global. And one of the things I was mentioning to one or two of you, one of the things that surprised me about our colloquium is it's very American. I mean, the experiences are all referencing the American system, both the capitalist economic system, the political systems, but also culture. The notion of culture in the United States is certainly not the notion in Europe. And I worked for many years in and with China, certainly not their notion of what culture is. So you have some meta concepts that you have to deal with, and sorting out conversational wavelengths between different groups within a society that shares certain cultural values is already difficult, but when you move it up, you get it far more difficult. And this can be complicated by the fact that certain cultures don't, for instance, in the past, didn't accord women a status that was at the same level as a man. So if the American government sent a woman to a meeting, they just turned off. The people who didn't want to talk to the person, we had a real problem here. And it wasn't something you could really address. The person who was the United States representative was far more qualified than the people who were turning off. But it was part of this problem. We have to be very aware of what has been called cognitive bias in our meetings. This is something that can lead to real blindsidedness. I'm not going to go through, but we can do it in the panel, the recent use of data to predict election results, for instance, and how this has been very surprising, that it's come out to be incorrect, and in virtually every case incorrect that I've seen since for about 2 years. why and how this happens. I want to say a word about who uses this, who does this. Principally, we worked with national intelligence agencies, military intelligence agencies, government agencies that did future work. Those were in presidential offices or prime minister's offices. They're looking from the bridge of the ship at where the ship is going. And they want to use these exercises as a stimulus to internal discussion about where we're going. The military and civilian intelligence agencies use it in an operational way. So they're using it to decide where to put resources, what's the world going to look like. And if you want to read some interesting examples of this, the National Security Council puts out an unclassified document every year on the future as seen from the national security community in the United States. And they deal with things that are very relevant to what we've been talking about, including enhanced human beings, automation, the use of robots, and other things. Why do we use this? Why do we do this? Because you're not giving a vision or a version of the future, you're giving a vision, and you give several. If this, then that. If this, then deducted, and we go in this direction, we could end up with this. It allows for governments and agencies to do what's called backcasting of policy, which they have to do. You know, if we're going to be faced with a demographic decline in the next 25 years, Germany, Japan, what are we going to do about this? If we're going to be faced by robotic automation in industry, what are we going to do about this? And there's a good example. The Japanese did this with us in 1992. They began the first discussions about robotics and what will happen to society in Japan with a high demographic of aging population when you start replacing them with robots. So the first thing they decided was robots will be accorded an individual status like a human being, and they will be taxed. The robot will be taxed the same way the individual is. And the enthusiasm for robotics then began to lessen. And that's in fact what is happening. And the model was, and this is really creative thinking, the people who are in the population now who are in their 40s will not be paying for Social Security benefits. They will be paying for their geriatric robot, which they will receive when they move into the benefit system. So there was a very planned kind of vision of where this would go. That's one example. The other two, the two things that we had to look at very often were the two arguments given about technology versus adaptation. And climate is one of these, but there are other areas where you could have these arguments. The time frame of technological development plotted along the problem set is too slow. Most technologies will not succeed in equilibrating the problem before it needs to. So the real problem now for technology is precise development based on precise problems, and not just because of the cost of these things, not just developing a large-scale program on the basis of interest. We also faced the problem of models. I mean, we talked about this today. Human models, the economy is a human construct. It's not a reality. It's transactional activities that we characterize as humans, and we then paint a picture of what it is, and we call that picture the market. And it works in mechanical ways, and equilibrium models could be one way of doing it. There are other ways of looking at it. However, we have another model that is running right beside us. It's Mother Nature. And her model is quite different. It's an equilibrium model based on void fulfillment. and competition for resources. Nature doesn't care if the human race survives. It cares that life survives. So if this experiment kind of doesn't work out, well, then maybe another experiment will. So we have to be aware of the fact that we're up against something that is not necessarily controllable. We have to understand it better, deal with it better, and adapt to it better. I'm not going to have the time to mention, I'm going to mention briefly, and then we'll come back to these, the 4 megatrends that I wanted to talk to today. The future of organized religion is a very serious problem that is not really well addressed. And this is partially the question of how faith is transmitted. What is being transmitted? What are the mechanisms for transmission? Who is doing it? And who is controlling it? You know, who is deciding whether this is the best and most effective mechanism? The institutional structures for most of organized religion are not well adapted for what's coming. And these have to be rethought out. But how are we going to do this? Because we have many models. The Christian models, there are many of those, but think of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Islam. They're all different kinds of models of adaptation. And so when we talk to people, we ask them, what does the institution look like in the future? We're very interested in augmentation of human beings. This is a military interest in most countries. It's the use of biomedicines to augment memory and augment capacity to survive wounds, auto-healing wounds, this kind of thing. We talked about artificial intelligence, and we'll maybe come back to that. That's a very big and important issue. It's developing. Is it developing faster than we understand? Is it becoming somewhat autonomous? And if so, what does that mean? I was going to say a few words about the singularity, which is a peculiarly Californian version of the future that Kurzweil has put forward, where man and machines come together and we transcend humanity and become the singularity, the machine man. And very imprudently, he has set the date for this, 2045. But most prudently, it is beyond what his expectation of life is. So there'll be no one around to tell him whether it worked or not. The future of jobs. We go back to this when we talk. This is a very serious problem because of, if you look at sectoral participation in the economy in the United States, the decline of the agricultural sector and the manufacturing sector over the last 100 years has been dramatic. And we're left now with a very large proportion in services and self-employment. So these are the things that are precisely being attacked by the new, by the automation. Emerging global communities, interconnectivity, and fractured multiple identities. We found it very difficult to talk to some groups because they no longer identified themselves in national ways, in tribal or racial ways, even language ways. They identify themselves often in gender positions, in gender cohorts, so they could be different countries, but you know, and I hear many times people referring to millennials, X generation, other things. This is the kind of an identity that didn't exist when I was younger. So this is emerging, and it's a construct. It's based on usually someone else writing a book and saying there's Generation X, and these are the qualities of Generation X. Then it becomes a media trope, and you can work through it. The last one I'll mention before I stop is environmental challenges in the future. We have 9 billion citizens, people in the world. On the high-end scenarios, the United Nations will have 12 billion by 2030. And these kinds of statistics, population statistics, are among the most stable. So the things you can use rather reliably about what resources are going to be needed unless radical innovations intervene and change the resource levels. Our concern was principally about energy, because as we said, energy is civilization. Without energy, there is no civilization. So where are you getting it? And, you know, we all know the debate. We don't need to go into the details, but there is no consensus on the trade-off and the risks of moving forward into, for instance, nuclear energy. And the idea is that you can make a package and that these things can work if they're put together. We'll rely on breakthroughs in storage capacity and in larger batteries and larger ways of conducting energy from one source, from the archive source to the user source. So these are, the environmental questions we looked at were largely about how are we going to create an energy efficient world that is also a world that is growing in consumption. Because I think someone mentioned it or referred to it somewhat this morning. If you raise the population of Brazil to the level of the United States, there would not be enough resources to take care of it. Brazil. Try India. China is a very good example. They are doing it. They're raising the level of the welfare level of the population. And I worked in China when the government was the only economic source of activity, and now it's a government-controlled market system. And you see all the problems of the Wild West right back in China. Pollution, overbuilding, water, every resource is being strained. So with this, I'll end with this. The one thing we haven't talked about, and I think is relevant, but not necessarily to talk about, is the risks of war and violence. These are real. And we had to factor them in whenever we looked at certain things like energy resources. The Middle East is just a powder keg. I mean, any movement in this area, moves the United States to move the embassy to Jerusalem, this could have absolutely disastrous effects if it's perceived as a move to change the attitude in the Middle East. You can think what well or bad of it, but it's something that somebody standing back has to think, what are we going to do? Iran, another case of this. Africa is scheduled to be the next big growth area in the next 60 to 70 years. And it's one of the last really untapped large resource areas of the world. So we don't have a lot of wiggle room on some of these things. Let me stop there and we can chat about this as we go along. As you see, it was touching on what most of you said better in the disciplinary kind of form.